Senator Tom Cotton, I want to thank you for coming on the program. I know you're in great demand, and one of the reasons you're in great demand is because you're a man of the military. You actually went overseas. You've been concerned about this for some time, and you're a very careful man in terms of what kind of military actions you think we should take and so forth. But, you know, I guess I disagree with a lot of people because I didn't see why having 2,500 non-combat soldiers, federal contractors, intel, and a massive base so we could keep an eye on things and also work with our friends and their military was such a bad thing. Where do you stand on this? And then I want to get into, obviously, this disaster that's taken place here.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for having me on in this very sad day for America and for our power and prestige in the world. I think the point you make, a lot of Americans are wondering right now. You heard a lot of criticism from the left and the right, frankly, about the duration of the Afghan war, and I understand why some Americans might grow weary of it. But what we never heard from the Biden administration, and certainly from Joe Biden when he announced this withdrawal in April, is how they would control the likely consequences of the withdrawal of that small force, one of which being the exact kinds of chaos that we see in Afghanistan now, our failure to get American citizens out of Afghanistan, to say nothing of Afghans who aided us. A second is how we can possibly prevent the Taliban from turning Afghanistan into a terrorist safe haven again. I've never heard a briefing on the Intelligence Committee or the Armed Services Committee from a Biden administration official about how they will conduct counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan without a presence there. And you heard Joe Biden today say that, don't worry, we have plans for, they called it, over-the-horizon counterterrorism strikes from hundreds and hundreds of miles away with no intelligence presence on the ground at all, which I suspect will be executed about as well as Joe Biden has executed a fairly routine non-combatant evacuation operation in Afghanistan the last few days.
Are you concerned we have a commander-in-chief, literally, who doesn't know what the hell he's doing? Whether it's his brain power or otherwise. I mean, I don't. How reckless and outrageous is this?
Mark, I want to remind all of your listeners of something that Bob Gates, a very accomplished public servant at the CIA and at the Department of Defense, who served as Secretary of Defense for both George Bush and Barack Obama, said about Joe Biden 10 years ago, that Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue of the last 4 decades. Well, now you can add a fifth decade to it. But here's the difference, Mark. Back then, he was just a senator. He was just the vice president. He was never in charge. So there were not many consequences to his terrible judgment. Now he is in charge. And after 50 years of hot air and poor judgment, we see the consequences of that poor judgment coming home to roost. I think he is totally overmatched by events. He's been hiding out in Camp David for 5 days. The speech you saw today is a speech of a president who is dangerously detached from reality, and now he's retreated back to Camp David once again.
I'm sitting here thinking, he talks about the last 4 presidents. I'm no Obama fan, of course, but I can speak to some of these presidents. We made tremendous headway in fighting these terrorists. In so many respects, he just handed it back to them. Now the Taliban control more of Afghanistan, that is, all of it, than they did before 9/11. Am I right?
Yeah, Mark, I think that you make an important point. I've heard some people say, well, we're back to where we were before 9/11. No, we are in a much worse position now than we were then. As you mentioned, the Taliban never conquered the northern part of the country. That's where you had the so-called Northern Alliance, the group of various tribal militias that our CIA paramilitaries and military special operations forces helped unite into a coherent fighting force after 9/11. They're the ones who primarily, with our assistance, toppled the Taliban in 2001. But now the Taliban controls all of Afghanistan. They also have the thousands and thousands of weapons and ammunition and equipment that we left behind, and they have the prestige of the perception of having driven America out of Afghanistan. So we are in a much worse position than we were before the 9/11 attacks.
And, I love the way they point to Trump. I was listening to General Keane, and among other things, Trump apparently had, it was supposed to be a pullout that had red lines. But they have no idea what Donald Trump would have done up to this point. And so for him to keep pointing to Donald Trump is amazing to me. For him to say he was really stuck because of Donald Trump. Senator, does he ever seem stuck because of Donald Trump, whether it's sending billions of dollars to the Iranians through allies or anything else?
Yeah. So if only Joe Biden had his hands tied by the Trump administration's policies and the course they had set, our border would still be closed, Mark. But Joe Biden conceives himself as tied to Donald Trump's policies. No other place in the world except for Afghanistan. And in fact, the former president has said things would have been very different had he remained in office, because he would have held the Taliban to their end of the deal. Obviously, the Taliban started violating the agreement they had with President Trump last year. They continue to do so this year. Whether you supported that agreement, whether you didn't support that agreement under President Trump, and for that matter, whether you agree or disagree with President Biden's decision to withdraw our troops, the execution of that decision has been catastrophically incompetent and impotent.
If you're Taiwan right now, if you're Ukraine right now, if you're Israel right now, what are you thinking?
You're not sleeping very well, I would suggest, Mark. Any partner around the world, which is, say, almost every partner who counts on American credibility, who counts on the credibility and the word and the judgment of the American president, right now is worried about whether or not this president will answer the bell when it's time to get in the ring. And in particular, that first one you said, Mark, Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's autonomy and the status quo between Taiwan and mainland China is almost entirely dependent on whether Xi Jinping thinks Donald Trump will come to Taiwan's defense if he goes for the jugular.
You mean Biden? Yeah.
Yes, whether Biden will come to Taiwan's defense if Xi decides to go for the jugular in Taiwan. Something tells me that over the last 72 hours, Xi Jinping is grinning like the cat who ate the canary when he thinks about Joe Biden's willingness to support Taiwan should the Chinese communists invade it.
I hear people say, why do we have troops overseas? And I'm thinking, well, we have them in South Korea. That war's been over a long time, more than half a century. We have them in Europe, including Germany. That war's been over even a longer period of time. China would love us to withdraw our troops from everywhere, wouldn't they, Senator?
Yeah, China and Russia both would love us to have all of our troops out of the old world and back in the new world. There's a lot of different reasons. There's always different histories about how we ended up and where we ended up, whether it's Japan or South Korea or Germany or Italy or Kuwait or Qatar, Bahrain, whatever you have, Mark. But the core reason why we have any troops forward deployed is that the central interest of America from the very beginning has always been to prevent an attack on our homeland, the kind of attack that happened on 9/11 and that's happened very rarely throughout the rest of our history. One way to ensure that doesn't happen is to go on the offense forward deployed. So we're not on defense on the last line of defense, which is our own homeland. And in particular, since World War II, we have decided as a nation that we will never allow a foreign power in the old world to combine its vast resources and territory and population and wealth and capabilities and marshal those against us in a way that could threaten our security here. Unfortunately, I think the Taliban is going to be able to do that once again in Afghanistan the same way they were in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this withdrawal, we pulled our air support, we pulled our intelligence, we shut down our main base, we pulled out the contractors. And General Keane has said, when you do that, after you're teaching this army or have taught this army, as weak as it is, that you need the fusion of these various activities in order to fight, and then you pull all those out and you leave our main base without even telling them. He said that in significant part completely undermined them. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, Mark. I mean, the Afghan army is not the 101st Airborne, let's be clear, but President Biden kneecapped them in every way. They weren't even really all that reliant on American air power in recent years, Mark. They had their own Air Force that we had helped stand up, primarily helicopters for close air support, but we pulled out so many of the civilian contractors who just do the basic maintenance and logistics work for them over the last few months, that those helicopters couldn't fly anymore. And if you train an army to be reliant on and to conduct operations in conjunction with close air support, and all of a sudden that air support is not available, guess what? They're not going to be nearly as well trained and not going to operate as effectively as they could have. I mean, it'd be like taking American Marines or soldiers who have been trained for decades to rely on highly networked operations with support from artillery and air power, and to say, okay, now you have no radios, you have no SATCOM, you have no artillery, you have no air support. We'd be better than the Afghan National Army, of course, but it is not the way they were trained to fight.
I'm very concerned about a lot of this, Senator, because now we have communist China and fascistic Russia. Can't wait to work with the Taliban. The Taliban obviously is close with Al-Qaeda and all these other terrorist organizations. Iran, even though they hate that form of Islam, they are aligned with these various terrorist movements. We have the traditional enemy situation aligned with the non-traditional enemy situation, more modern situation. So we have terrorists, and now a terrorist nation, in addition to Iran, Afghanistan. And China, which has obvious intentions of becoming a superpower, and Russia, which has obvious intentions of expanding its power they're all working together, either directly or in a passive way. I've never seen anything like this. Have you?
No, we are in a perilous moment, Mark, and you're correct to identify that you have both our traditional nation-state adversaries like China, like Russia, now working in concert with enemies like the Taliban and associated terrorist groups and Iran. Now, Russia and China do have their own threat from Islamic radicals inside their countries or on their borders, but one simple way for them to deal with that threat is to make it clear what a punitive retaliation they will launch if there are any attacks on their own soil. If, however, you want to attack the Americans, well, not only will we look the other way, we'll applaud you. In much the same way that all of these cyber hacks and ransomware attacks come from Russian soil, yet they never seem to target Russian institutions. It's only American institutions. I suspect you'll see the similar kind of tacit support for the Taliban, or explicit support for the Taliban, and tacit support for the terrorist groups that operate under the Taliban's umbrella in Afghanistan from China and from Russia.
Before we leave, Senator, I know you're going to say, well, this is kind of old hat. Remind people of your service background, would you?
Sure, Mark. I was in my last year of law school when the 9/11 attacks were launched, and that made me want to serve. I finished up school and paid off my loans, but I enlisted a couple years after I graduated law school and served 5 years, long stint at Fort Benning, Fort Beginning for boys, as they used to call it. And then I was in Iraq with the 101st Airborne. I was up in northeast Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009 with a reconstruction team. And between those tours, I served at Arlington National Cemetery.
You wrote a beautiful book about that. You're going to lose some of your friends, maybe, that you met in Afghanistan, do you think?
I'm afraid that many of them in my old area of operations are probably already lost if they have not in recent months been able to get out of the country, maybe into Pakistan or elsewhere. And I'm fearful for so many Afghans who supported us over the last 20 years. But I also want to stress, Mark, that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of American citizens with American passports behind enemy lines. My office has been running a hotline for the last 24 plus hours, and we've heard directly from so many Americans who cannot contact the embassy, who have no guidance beyond shelter in place and wait to hear from us. That's the kind of incompetence that we've seen from the Biden administration in executing what should be a fairly straightforward non-combatant evacuation operation.
Well, we're going to have to go, but, for Biden to be silent for 6 days, give this really self-serving speech, and then go back to Camp David, for the Secretary of Defense to be hiding out right now, I just think this is all so damn appalling. It's humiliating, and it's enormously dangerous. Senator, I want to thank you for your leadership. Please keep it up, sir.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's good to be on with you.